Good morning, everyone. Thanks for making yourselves available again to meet and listen to Jock today, who's going to continue with our series of lectures on critical elements and green options and finding alternative options in this country to Eskom and our unreliable power supply. Just by way of background, Jock is a University of Natal geology graduate where he ended up doing an MSc. And he then did a PhD, effectively part-time at the University of Cape Town. He subsequently spent about 20 years in research and teaching. He spent time at the CSIR. He did a lot of isotope work. And then he progressed, like many of us, to the exploration and mining sector, particularly in the junior exploration and mining sector. And he's worked in various interesting parts of the world. He's also, in his time, done work on rare earth elements, and I guess that will probably also come up today somewhere along the line. Anyway, thanks, Jock. Thanks for making yourself available, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks a lot, John. Between John and I, we had a number of different titles for the talk as things have changed. And after what the fantastic talks that Niels and Clyde gave, point has shifted a little bit, so the title might be a little bit misleading, but I think when we get to the end, you'll see where we're going to. So just to start off with a bit of a disclaimer, I'm not an expert in either the minerals markets or the energy sector like our previous talkers. I'm just a geologist. And my interest in exploration, including rare earths, is where I actually have developed an interest in green energy. And in exploring for rare earths, it's obvious that you have to know and study up on where the rare earths are used. And they have a huge role to play in emissions lowering technologies and stuff. I developed this course when I was at Rhodes, largely for the explorationists, for the new guys coming into exploration. If they're exploring for things like the critical metals, it's critical that they understand the technologies behind that. And so I put this little course together. And what I'm going to be talking about today actually doesn't have much about rare earths at all. So I'm in a sort of field that I'm very much more finding public domain information to go forward. Okay, so obviously climate change has sort of changed our world. And the quest for low emissions is driving the green energy change. Not everyone's a believer. Donald Trump had a lot of negative things to say about global warming. Last year at the COP26 conference in Glasgow, a whole bunch of countries agreed to phase out coal power stations. Some didn't, Australia being one of the prominent ones, one of the most highly emitting countries per capita in the world. These sorts of diagrams often shown, these are from The Guardian, look very, very dramatic, but if you look closely at them, those are actually cooling towers. So that's mostly steam coming out. And if you look at these smoke towers here, they don't seem to be emitting too much, but let's not get bogged down in details. Some people just found it all a bit of a yawn. One of the little activists, she wasn't impressed at all. But whatever your feeling is about change to green energy and stuff, there's a huge amount of investment going into clean energy. And Bloomberg have a special division now, the New Energy Fund, and they bring out reports every now and then with a very nice source of information. But this diagram from there shows that between 2011 through to 2019, the investment into new energy applications was over 300 billion per year on average. If you compare that to the investments in exploration over those times, it's about at least 10 times more. So there's a lot of money going into the sector. It's not just sentimental, let's put it that way. Okay, let's have a look at how South Africa's energy is generated. Obviously, largely Eskom, and most of it is from coal-powered stations. Our power production is 96%, this is in 2015 from a DMR report, from fossil fuels. So we are heavily reliant on fossil fuel production. This graph here sort of shows it quite well. Most of that is coal. And if you just do a quick calculation of the terawatt hours, how that breaks down, coal's responsible for about 75% of the electricity we use each day. Is this the only way we can generate the electricity? The number of reports commissioned over the last 5 years or so, many of them involving Eskom, that paint another picture. And this particular one here, wind and solar photovoltaic, they say that the wind potential and solar potential in South Africa is quite more than adequate to meet our electricity demands. Here's another report saying the same thing, that in pointing out the costs of energy technologies like solar and wind and battery storage has dropped significantly in recent times, since 2015 sort of. And the price of renewable energy is very, very competitive to the old school fossil fuel thing. So there's very little excuse not to get into the sector. In that report, there's some quite nice maps of the solar potential in South Africa and the wind potential. And you'll see that these contours I've just shown down here, in the solar potential here, these colors here, the very dark orange is 2,200 to 2,600, averaging around, say, 2.5 kilowatt hours. And these dark reds up here are over 2,800 kilowatt hours generating capacity per square meter. And obviously, the Northern Cape here is very, very high potential for solar. And if we go across to wind, you'll see that where we've got escarpments and things, there's some very, very high generating capacity here in, for example, in the Eastern Cape. And here we're looking at somewhere in the order of 5 megawatts per hectare. So very, very high generating capacities. Clyde mentioned the other day a little hotspot, and I guess what he was talking to is this little area here, which has extremely high solar potential just near Beaufort West, as well as wind potential. So this website, the International Renewable Energy Agency, has a very, very good website where you can extract data for places around the world and generate graphs and things. So I just had a look there quickly. It's up to date up to 2021. And so in South Africa, our installed wind and solar capacity is around about 9 gigawatts. And you'll see this here is wind, big growth from about 2012 in the wind generation in South Africa, but also a very large increase in solar, voltaics and thermal. If you convert that into actual electricity generation, the picture's somewhat different. You'll see that solar really dominates the overall picture. And here we're top of this little skyscraper here, we're looking at somewhere just over 7 terawatt hours. Storing electricity, green energy applications like solar, wind can only generate electricity when sun shines in solar or the wind blows with wind. And periods of peak generation generally don't coincide with periods of peak consumption. Here's two nice little plots. This is wind generation, I think in the Western Cape, through 31 days in January 2015. Okay, it's midsummer, so we've got lots of solar energy from 6, 7 o'clock in the morning around to about 6 o'clock at night, but nothing obviously once the sun goes down, and concentrated in the middle of the day. And if you go to wind, you'll see that the wind is peaking down in the 4 o'clock till 8 o'clock sort of period. The fit to the consumption pattern, if you like, isn't all that good. And so it's obviously better if we can store the energy, we can use this all over. Another aspect of storing energy from these outputs is that you can store the energy and then release it into the grid when the value is the highest. We'll talk about the bidding things later, but the South African initiative to encourage green energy generation, all the energy generated from 5 o'clock in the morning till 4:30, and then from 9:30 to 10 o'clock is at a standard tariff. However, in these areas, times here of peak consumption, the value of the electricity is 2.7 times that. Okay, so by storing the electricity, you can actually sell it at a higher rate, if you like. And then the other reason to store electricity, if you need to use it in mobile devices. Small ones, examples are mobile phones, tablets, and laptops, and larger ones if we're going to power motor vehicles. So what's the best solution for storing electricity? And it's very much a horses for courses story. It's dependent on how and where the power is going to be utilized. And so for mobile, if you're going with smartphones and stuff, we need to store the energy in small, light, rapidly rechargeable batteries, okay? Whereas if for bulk storage, like for grid applications, size and portability is not that important. It's not as important as the capacity of the battery, its durability, and how many discharge, recharge cycles it can go through. So here's a graph that shows this quite nicely. So up this axis here is the discharge time at the rated power. In other words, how long do we need the power? And along this axis is how much electrical power do we actually need? So this is the sort of area we're in when we're talking about generating electricity on a national scale. And you'll see there's a lot of talk about using lithium-ion batteries for this sort of storage. And they have a limit in storing large amounts of energy. And applications like flow batteries or molten salt technologies are better types of storage for this sort of application. And so we'll have a look at some of these redox flow batteries, what they actually are. And these are useful in this sense because the cathode and anode materials are actually solutions. Unlike in a battery where you've got them mixed in a finite little volume, these can be stored in tanks. And the electrolyte itself, being a solution, if you're charging and the solution you have in the battery becomes fully charged, you don't have to stop. You just pump that solution out and pump fresh, uncharged electrolyte in. And so you have an ability to store much larger quantums of power by just having bigger tanks. And likewise in the discharge, once you've run your battery down, you can just pump some more electrolyte in and your battery keeps going. It's a very quick swap around that you can use. These are scalable. To get increased power, all you do is what they call, have a stacked cell. So you have a whole bunch of these membranes together being fed by your electrolyte tanks. So these are big things. This is an example, a fairly small one in the States. It's a small 4 megawatt hour facility. These are from off-the-shelf VRFBs, SUMITOMO electric. I recommend you go into the website and have a look. It's really interesting. So for example, here you can fill a container with the solution and the battery. So these are individual batteries. And this here is a huge rack. These tanks here are the electrolyte solutions, and these are the actual cells. So it just gives you an idea of how large these things can be, and they're virtually infinitely scalable in a way. These have implications on a wider scale, and this company, RedT, is it's a British company that is involved in this. And with these big storage batteries, the paradigm can change. You can move away from a centralized grid type of system and move to what they refer to as distributed energy systems. So within a regional area, you can have a smaller grid that's not necessarily connected to the main grid, fed by these bulk storage type of applications. We'll come back to this later because I think this has some implications to our mining industry and some developments in the legal background to these things. Okay, in South Africa, we actually have a company, Bushveld Energy, one of the Bushveld Minerals companies, had a number of vanadium deposits, and they've spun off a creative little energy company focusing very much on vanadium redox flow batteries. And back in 2019, they announced the fact that they were developing a fairly large battery as a test case with Eskom. This is a 450 kilowatt hour peak output, really large battery. And that compares to probably one of the biggest ones that I know of, lithium-ion battery, that was done as almost a marketing gimmick by Elon Musk at Tesla in South Australia a few years ago, which he built one of 129. This is now way more than 3 times that capacity. A recent update, they are actually developing at their Vanadium mine, Vametco mine, an actual redox battery that will partly run the electricity at the mine. And they're doing this as an exercise, a mini grid project to supply 10% of their energy requirements. It's quite encouraging. It's very much to say, well, if you can talk about these things as much as you like, but once you actually make one and show people that it works, I think we're on the right track in developing these things here. Let's move across to solar, as the main focus of what I want to talk about today, which is harvesting the sun's light and heat as photovoltaics, where we take the photon energy, and then the other application is actually using the sunlight itself. Now, this is an oldish graph, but you'll see what this is the cost of generation as a percentage compared to an arbitrary reference plant in Spain. Now, why in Spain? Well, the Spanish in the last 5 or 6 years have become the leading lights in developing solar technologies. And all this is pointing out is as you have higher direct normal radiation, in other words, lots of sunlight, the more sunlight you actually have in the area you live in, the cheaper it is to generate electricity. So Spain would be over here. Spain has a large amount of deployed solar power generation. So relative to what's working well in Europe, if you go to countries like where we are here, South Africa, Algeria, Morocco, the power generation is much, much cheaper. And we've been deploying a lot of Voltaic power in South Africa. Just a couple of examples. This is the Jasper solar power thing near Kimberley, 96 megawatts with 180 gigawatts per annum production. This is another one, an example, Lesedi. And you see again, around about 75 megawatts for one of these farms. And this is an important picture because you often see these photographs. It looks like these are just a bunch of solar panels put on the ground, but they are focused. These panels can tilt and they're kept pointed at the sun. There's just some other plants, and you'll see these are all in the Northern Cape, obviously, because you remember the map, very, very high solar radiation in that area. So in amongst these ones that I've just highlighted here, there's about 750 gigawatt hours per annum of generating power. And from what I can gather from on the websites, there's about 30 active plants around the country with about 1.3 terawatt power generating capacity. Now let's get on to the other one, the alternative ways. And these are concentrating solar plants. These plants, in other words, are not taking the photon energy, it's actually using the heat of the sun itself. And this is a spectacularly new generating center in Ouarzazate in Morocco called Noor. And there's Noor 1, 2, and 3, different types of concentrated solar. And that's the generating capacity there is just under a terawatt of generating capacity. So let's have a look at how these things work. They produce electricity by concentrating the sun's rays, heat up a liquid, a gas, or solid exchange medium that is then used to generate electricity via steam-driven turbines like we normally do. And most CSP plants, they consist of a concentrated system and what they call a power block, and that's where the heat exchanging takes place, the creation of the steam, and to drive a conventional generator. CSP is not for everyone, obviously. It's critically dependent on the intensity of the sun, the direct radiation, which is shown here. And you can see in Southern Africa, South Africa and Namibia, very, very well endowed. Chile, extremely so, much of Australia, the Arab countries, and North Africa. And listed on the right here are some of the prime areas, and you'll see that we are very much in the list. If you look at the deployed, installed CSP around the world, if you have a look at South Africa here, 700 megawatts, we're sitting pretty well compared to the distribution around the world. Now, you'll see the different colors here. Blue is operational, and red is under construction, green is in development. This is slightly old in South Africa here. We've got 100 megawatts that's under construction stroke development, and the rest is operational. So we have about 600 megawatts of operational system. And you'll see from this graph from 2006 through to the present that for a long time, Spain and the USA were the major users of this technology. The United States started it, and Spain developed it and developed the expertise. So a lot of the companies that are involved here are Spanish-based companies. But since about 2013, 2014, a lot of new players have come in. And if we look at them, you'll see these are very much exactly the list that we said in the previous diagram, where it's really suitable. So Morocco is where the Ouazzazate one is. They're doing a lot of development and deployment of these plants in Morocco, as are we here in South Africa. And these are where they're situated. This is the one that's still under development, and we'll talk a bit about that later. This is the Redstone one. And you'll see most of these are, there's two that are 50 megawatt, but most of them are 100 megawatt generating capacities. And as you'll see, they're all up in the Northern Cape. The different collector types that are used, and the ones we'll focus on, the ones that are most commonly used and the ones that are used here in South Africa, are a central receiver. It's sometimes referred to as a power tower, where the sun is focused on the top of a tower with a big reservoir of salt in it. Or alternatively, instead of having it focused on one point, you have these parabolic troughs with a pipe holding the heat holding material along these sort of pipes here. So the power tower, you've got sun tracking mirrors around you. They're called heliostats, that focuses the sun's energy on the central receiver as the sun moves. So these things move and keep it focused on that point. In that central receiver, there are salts, either alkali salts, or sometimes they use thermal oil. And that heats up and can hold temperatures up to about 600 degrees centigrade. And then that is exchanged with using water to produce steam and to pass it through a conventional sort of turbine generator to produce electricity. So here we have the receiver, the heliostats focusing on where the salts are. They melt. You have your hot salt tank here. That's the heat exchanging, and there's your turbine generator. This then gets returned, cold back up into the receiver and to be reheated. Here's an example. This is the one in Ouazzazate. That is glowing like that's because of the sun's heat. That's actually radiation, heat radiation you're seeing off the top of one of these power towers, and these are all the heliostats. This is one in South Africa. It was one of the first developed, started producing electricity in 2017. In Uppington, if you've driven past there, you'll see it's very, very prominent. If you just have a look at the distribution of the heliostats, you'll see it's fairly heart-shaped. We'll have a look at the Nora one just now, and you'll see that the distribution is quite different, and I'll talk about that later. The other type is a parabolic trough. So this is a better diagram. Here you've got the pipes holding the actual heat exchanger, and these parabolic troughs, mirrors, focus the heat onto these pipes, and that is then ducts the hot, they normally use oil, hot liquid off to the same sort of exchanger and the same generating process. Here are some examples, and you'll see here again, this is glowing because the sun's heat is actually focused on there. So this will be where the transfer oil is stored, and that gets then ducted out to the power block for heat generating. Now, this Sena company, which is a Spanish company, they took the molten salt that was used in the tower type of system, and they started using it in parabolic systems as well. So in other words, the parabolic system, instead of using the heated oil to go and create steam and generate power, they used it to melt the salt. And so this is just their justification or explanation of what it is. These molten salts, they hold their heat for a fair amount of time. So in other words, you can use the heat in the hot salt, you can store that heat and keep that generating capacity. So that's what we saw before. This is this molten salt thermal energy. These have very, very high heat capacities. It's relatively easy to hold that heat in to the salt, and that gives you a way of storing power. So here is an example. I think this is from the Crescent Dunes facility, which is in California. It's a scan through a normal day. So the yellow here is the sun. So the heat coming from the sun, you'll see mornings it heats up. So that's tracking the sun during the day. Now, what these plants do is you'll see here, this is the generating of electricity. There's no major demand for electricity here. So instead of generating electricity, they just melt more and more salt. When it gets to the demand increases, you then start using that heat to generate electricity. The bit that you save, the heat that you store in the salt, you can then use once the sun goes down, you can then generate electricity going forward. So this is the energy collection into the salt, and this is using that stored energy to generate electricity. And so you can actually extend the time that you can generate your electricity. This is a little bit more complicated. It shows exactly what's going on here. So this blue line here is where you're generating from the sun. And here is the heat that you stored in the salt, where you start to use your stored salt. So that is directly generated from sun, the blue one. The green is where you're generating from your stored salt. And that is your effective extra storage time, the extra generating time that you buy from using this salt generation. So we've got a number of the plants in South Africa. The first two that were installed, Solar One, Key and Kaku Solar One, this is a parabolic, this was a power tower. These were built just to supply electricity while the sun was up. Both of them, obviously when the sun goes down, the salts are still hot. So in the Uppington one, was able to run at full capacity for 2 hours after the sun went down. But the idea was to supply electricity to Uppington. That was great. But from then on, all of these actually have storage capacity for extra salt. And you'll see down here is the storage time that these have. Bokpoort, 9 hours, 5 hours, 5 hours, 4.5 hours. And this plant at the end here, Redstone, which is under development, we'll talk about why it's still under development. It was supposed to come on stream and scheduled for around about 2020. The updated is the 4th quarter of next year. That has the capacity to store for 12 hours. That effectively means that this solar plant can generate electricity around the clock. So let's have a look at what these things look like. This is the Kaku Solar One near Pofado, one of the early ones that was set up. There's your reflectors. This is the power tower we've seen before. You can see this is operational. You can see a bit of the steam coming out the top. And now these are the ones with more salt storage. You see, these here are big tanks. This is the Ilanga one. These are tanks that have excess salt. That's where they hold the extra heat to generate after the sun goes down. This one has 5 hours of storage. And here, Katu, you can see these big storage tanks. This is the artist's impression of the Redstone plant. It'll be 100 megawatts with the 12 hours of generating capacity. And it's sited right next to these two photovoltaic PV plants that have been around for quite a while. This artist's impression is essentially the Wazazite plant just dropped in on this photograph. Why is it still under development? There have been a number of delays, and most of it is due to our friend Eskom. This is in 2017. When these awards are granted, Eskom basically is the offtake agent, and they need to sign these. This is one bid that was in. They delayed it for a year and a half. Two of these plants from the same developer. One was signed. Redstone was next on the table, but it wasn't. And it delayed the start of this project by at least 1.5 years. Just to give you an example, this is some of the details of the one in Wazas in Morocco. And you can see here that that has storage as well. This is a photovoltaic. But if you look at the times here, it's more or less the same time as we were installing our CSP plants. But they're on schedule, and they have now nearly a terawatt of generating capacity in production working here in Morocco. So let's just go quickly through this Renewable Energy Independent Power Procurement Program. It's another one of these big acronyms. There have been a bunch of different bids. The way it works is that the regulators say, okay, we will prepare to put up over here, make available 1850 megawatts of wind, solar PV, solar CSP, et cetera, and then people can bid for it. And then the bids are accepted. That's what this awarded bid means. There's been a number of these bids. Here you can see there was bid 3. It was extended to add more CSP. And in 4B, this is the Redstone one. The bid 5 was cancelled, and there's been delays. But if you're interested in these sorts of things, there's a very good website with these renewable energy, the procurement programs. That's the URL. And there you can actually go and search the database and drop down and select all the things and get all the wind and all the actual new energy stuff is there. It's quite a good resource. And here's just an example, the actual capacity of the CSP plants that are out there. This program has been widely lauded by press around the world. Here's one example, one of the world's best renewable energy tenders, but there's room for improvement. And they go through a number of reasons why. One of them is just the regulatory things, like this is an artist's impression simply because of mess ups with the regulations. And this is explained here, we saw this just now. Bid window 5, that was launched in 12th of April 2021. The 25 bidders were announced on the 28th of October, and these have not been signed off. And the timelines for these preferred bidders to come on stream to sign them is expected by no later than the end of September this year. So it's taken 18 months delay in actually getting those things signed up. Now, each of these bids, there's a contractor who's raised finance and everything and is just sitting waiting for the MRE to get the act together. One of the other problems is actually getting plants built. This is a publication from 2015, I think, 2016. It only has the first 3 bids. They highlight problems, causes of delays in construction. Weather, 64, not much you can do about that, but 26% strikes or social unrest. Supply chain, small, construction delays, together 10%, but a lot of it just from union strikes or local disagreements. Just want to finish off quickly. In the mining press and for a number of years now, there's a lot of talk about coming to an alternative to supply electricity to the mines because of Eskom's unreliability. Yeah, again, November 21, massive power projects, but they want government to cut red tape. The Minerals Council talking about the mining industry could add in 3.9 gigawatts of power generation, but wants clarity on the rules. Again, problems with the regulatory system. Anglo American earlier this year committed itself to take all its South African operations completely off the grid. In June, there was probably one of the most important changes in regulations in this regard. I think it surprised most people. Ramaphosa announced that the limit beyond which you have to actually get a license to generate power and sell power on was shifted from 1 megawatt before to 100 megawatts. The recommendation from the resource minister had been 10 megawatts, but he obviously got overruled to 100 megawatts. Now, all of the wind generating projects in the procurement plan are maxed at 75 megawatts. The concentrated solar is at 100 megawatts. So what that means is virtually all of these new schemes that are coming on can be standalone. If you can use the power, you can generate it, and you don't have this limitation. You don't have to get a license. And that, I think, is a big open door now for the mining industry, I think, to start thinking outside the box. Just to highlight the fact that all of these plants would be under the limit. All of these plants are based in the Northern Cape, places like Aggeneys and Gamsberg having problems with electrical supply for their operations. It would be an obvious sense to actually get an offtake with these sorts of users or future users. And just to get back to the distributed energy storage idea, the mining industry is probably the best to fit into this type of model, where you have a smaller off-grid mini-grid powered by your own generating plants, not linked to the national grid, not beholden to Eskom. And with that 100 megawatt limitation, I think that's really comes into the sector. It's about the right amount to get going on. That's all I've got. There are lots of questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Dr. Bristow has got something to ask.
Jock, just in terms of capital expenditure, how does a big solar panel system compare with the other option that you've talked about at some length today, the molten salt?
A very important thing here, the concentrated solar is more expensive per kilowatt than, say, photovoltaics and wind. But what you have to bear in mind is these salt-enabled plants, they actually have the power storage built in. So the cost of photovoltaics and wind doesn't take into account the storage cost to allow that power to actually be used on demand, as it were. And I think that's the important difference. Plants like the Redstone one is brought on, then the actual development cost is the final cost.
I understand that, but just a round figure. I mean, I'm just interested in general. I mean, are you looking at orders of magnitude, or you know, obviously the great benefit is the fact that you can store and then hopefully as they get better, run it through the night. Just an idea though, in terms of broad numbers.
I didn't actually do a direct comparison, but these CSP plants, they run from about $500 million to over $800, $900 million.
Okay, heading for $1 billion, yeah.
Yeah. But again, as in all these things, as the technology rolls out, it becomes cheaper.
Yeah. No, it's just interesting. I mean, given the situation in South Africa and not being particularly investor friendly, and as you've highlighted, Jock, I mean, some of these delays, if you're going to build a 900 million or even a $500 million project, you don't want to sit around and wait on your hands. But if you make that commitment, you obviously want to be able to get on and do it. You know, the flip side, of course, is the PVs are sort of cheap and quick and nasty, you know, so I guess you've got to sort of balance the two.
There are stats out of graphs for the cost per kilowatt hour. The problem is that the solar PV and the wind, they don't include the storage costs in there. So if you're going to do it like, which a lot of people seem to be talking about, is using lithium-ion batteries, those, you know, are coming down in price, but they are expensive. And it's an added thing that needs added to the cost of that source of electricity.
Yeah, Jock, I think it goes back to sort of the overall plan. And again, it comes back to policy. Clyde Ellison did a very good study looking at the big picture and the comparison of all the systems. And I guess that's really what it's about. There's somewhat horses for courses. I mean, for households and factories or malls, for example, you know, big malls that see most of their traffic through the day, you know, a PV system, which you can fit on these massive roof structures on the malls, you know, probably works. And then you would have small batteries, you know, really just to give you an evening session in the shops, and then, you know, lighting for security.
No, absolutely. Clyde's that model of his was really, really impressive. And it's, you know, I agree. I'm not punting this as
absolutely not saying that. Yeah.
It's just a really interesting technology. And I was sort of focusing on it because Clyde in his talk said that, CSP had been cut off at the knees by the growth of photovoltaics. And yet we've been rolling out quite a lot of this stuff here. Morocco is putting a lot of money in the Arab countries. In the table I put up there, you'll see this ACWA Aqua. It's an Arabian base now. They've taken over parts of the technologies, the Spanish ones, and they're actually quite a big player in the game now, and they're developing in Morocco and whatnot. And the other thing that I find quite amazing is that those are quite big quantums of money, and there seems to be no problem raising them. And the number of the South African banks that are involved in these projects and that is quite impressive. If you think about it, they're not going in there just for fun, or because it's the thing to do. They're going in because they can make money. So if you can make money at the moment where you have this, offtake agreement with Eskom, that is the final end to it. If you want to go with these little dispersed or distributed grid systems where you don't have that, I mean, the investment must be infinitely more attractive. And so if you can raise it under the constrained things that we are at the moment, I see no reason why it wouldn't be even more attractive.
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's definitely, that comes back to my point. There's definitely a need for a sort of, grand plan without getting bogged down in paper. But they're different options, and we should be looking, aggressively at the range of options. I mean, and just for interest, I know all the mining companies are talking about, going off grid or setting up their own power generation systems. You must have done a little bit of work on that. I mean, what are they typically looking at in terms of infrastructure or types of power?
I haven't actually seen too much recently, and I think what's happened is the president's lifting of that level to 100 megawatts is, everybody's got to not go back to square one. It's very positive, but it opens the doors wider. You can actually think bigger, and it's a real paradigm shift. It'll be interesting to see if hopefully the mining industry will pick it up and run with it. But the other thing, that doing some research on the bid, I haven't actually needed to look at that before, and going through that system, there's quite a lot online, and the rules have changed from the time that started through the different bid windows. And the stuff close to now, you can go online and you can get the materials that you would need to fill in and go the loops you have to jump through in order to get bid in. And I'll send you some.
Hopefully it is getting better and more streamlined, because wherever you go in this country, and obviously the mining sector and exploration sector, I mean, the red tape is scary. And if only we could get rid of more and more of the red tape, we would have a much more healthy industry and growth, particularly in the small and junior sector. So yeah, we look forward to improved policy regime and less red tape.
Do you have an handle on if we had to go, let's say, primarily on solar power and wind, in terms of the footprint, percentage-wise? We've got all of this area, but how much will it actually upset the farmers? And how much area, or is it negligible in terms of the bigger picture? Just because people talk about that, and that's one of the first questions of objection. They say, well, look, you're going to be having a forest of mirrors out there. Is it that big?
Well, the thing is, where peak generating areas are for solar is in the Northern Cape, and you're not cramped for space there. You're very lucky in that sense. If your best sun areas were in, where there's a lot of population, a lot of farming, a lot of other things going on, it does become a bit of a problem. But, I think with us, we're pretty well set for that.
Yeah, Henny, it was quite interesting in Clyde's talk, just thinking back to it. He actually talked about the footprint and came to the conclusion that PV and solar and wind and the sort of options Jock's talking about would at the end of the day end up with a very small footprint compared to existing mining operations. And I guess logically that probably makes sense. And Clyde certainly did a lot of homework and knows that whole business well. But if you look at mines, particularly say in the eastern, well, it used to be the Eastern Transvaal and Mpumalanga, by the time you add in the mine infrastructure and then the tailings dumps and the overburden that you've moved, and then the lack of real and proper rehabilitation, and then I guess also all the consequences of acid mine water for acid mine drainage, there has to be benefits looking at these alternatives which have a footprint, but sure as hell they're a whole lot cleaner. I don't think we realize the costs at the stage of pollution and acid mine drainage. It's scary, I think.
Something that people don't often talk about with the thermal power stations. When I was at the CSR, the atmospherics guys had a contract to go. Acid rain was going to kill us in those days. That was the biggest concern. So they went and did a survey and found that the actual SO2 coming from the power stations was small, wasn't very much. But where the SO2 was coming from was spontaneous combustion on the waste dumps in the coal sulfide there. It wasn't coming out of the power stations, but feeding the power stations was creating the SO2 in the thing. So as a power station, you could say, well, look, you're not emitting more than X, Y, Z. But the coal miners, the coal is sulfide rich, and that is something to bear in mind.
Looking at the crystal ball, and it's just leap into the future a little bit, yeah, and say that the Western Province is not going to get on with the rest of South Africa. Would they be able to become self-sufficient in power? Would they have to buy in from the rest of the country? Is there a possibility? Is it posturing? Or do you think they'll actually be able to do it?
Now we'll do an alliance with the Northern Cape, 2 provinces.
We'll swap wine for power. I think if you listen to the talk in the province, and I guess Jock's touched on it briefly, there's a lot of solar power going up in sort of the northern part of the Western Cape, corrected Jock, and also obviously it has wind potential. I'm not smart enough to know whether you could build enough wind farms and solar farms to take yourself off the rest of the country. Thanks, Jock, and thanks, Henny.
Thank you very much, guys.